Will 2019 be the year we get closer to reaping a longevity dividend? How do we make the most of our aging society when inequality, inertia, and ageism skew the experience of living healthy, longer lives? I've come to a cafe just down from the International Longevity Centre in the UK's political heart of Westminster to find out. David Sinclair is the Centre's director. Good to have you in so early in the new year.
Nice to be here. Nice to be with you.
First things first, David, the what and why of the International Longevity Centre, and tell us about the work you do.
So the International Longevity Centre was set up 20 years ago by Baroness Greengross, inspired by Professor Robert Butler, who was an American doctor who won a Pulitzer Prize for coining the phrase ageism in the 1960s, actually. ILC is now one of 17 organisations across the world who look at the impact of ageing on public policy. And that can mean absolutely almost anything you can possibly imagine. One day we might be doing work on driverless cars, another day it might be on health or immunisation, another day it might be on do older people have sex. We do absolutely any possible area you can imagine. We do global issues, we do local, and we're really fundamentally interested in how we can ensure that future generations of older people benefit from the extra years they have.
So once you study all these things, who sees your studies?
So what we try to do, and what my job really is to try and understand what those clever academics and the scientists out there are saying about ageing, and try and find ways to communicate that to policymakers, decision makers across the world. So that includes politicians, journalists, civil servants. So we spend a lot of time talking to government about what ageing is really like, with a view to how public policy needs to adapt to the really exciting changes we're seeing in society.
And do you propose solutions?
Yes, so ILC is very much solutions and futures-focused organisation. We don't see the point in research for research's sake. What we want to be doing is identifying problems, but actually there's no point in us doing a report saying younger people aren't saving enough. Everyone knows that. The idea is actually us to be getting out there and saying, well, actually, what do we as a society need to be doing? And I think the reality is that we do need to be looking at radical changes in the way we live our lives in order to adapt to those extra years we've got.
Yes, I guess we could say that no one can save these days. It's Crunchville all around.
Absolutely.
And how are you funded?
ILC is funded by a mix of private and voluntary sector funders, including the pharmaceutical industry, financial service industry, but also charities. We're a small organisation. There's only 10 members of staff, so we're not a huge organisation.
What about some of the ageing foundations?
Certainly compared to some of the other organisations, we're tiny. Our total income is about £700,000. Some of those are 10, 50, 100 million. So we're a small player, and we work very well with other partners in the sector.
Now, before we get into the challenges and the opportunities of population aging, remind us, please, of the vital statistics of the demographic shifts underway to varying degrees across the world.
Yeah. So across the world, we have been having fewer children, and at the same time, we have been living a lot longer. So what that means is that the average age of most populations has been increasing, and we've got to a point where growing proportions of the population in almost every country across the world is older than it's ever been in the past. Now, this is a huge success story, but also poses big challenges for policymakers. If you look across the world, we are aging at very different pace. Arguably, in the UK, France, America, we've been aging for hundreds of years. We've been aging for 200, 300 years in the UK and France, for example.
It's curious the way you phrase that. We've been aging. Well, all humans age.
Yeah.
We're born, we live, we die.
So I suppose what I mean is that as a society, we've been gradually living longer for 200 or 300 years. So it's not long ago, 100 or so years ago, where life expectancy might have been half what it is. What's happened over the last century in particular, though, is we have seen introduction of clean water, clean air, reductions in infectious diseases, introduction of vaccination. What that really did was reduce the likelihood that we would die in childhood. What's happening now, actually, across the world is we're starting to see interventions that's reducing the likelihood that we die in old age. So actually, whereas, the initial vaccinations, for example, were all focused on children, we're starting to see more vaccinations focusing at people in their 50s and 60s. So actually, we can live longer and healthier.
Well, it's like we've been given a new stage of life, if not 2 or 3 stages to what used to be, for the past 70 years, be called retirement.
Absolutely, and we've got no plan as to what this stage is for. The governments are terrified about trying to tell people what it's for, probably quite rightly. Individuals haven't really planned for it because they weren't expecting it, because it is relatively new.
The only model we have is our parents and our grandparents.
And our lives are going to be different to the way that our parents and grandparents did live. One of the things, I suppose, that, the challenge of the fact that Europe has been gradually increasing, the number of older people we've seen in the population, has been that hasn't created an incentive for policymakers to act. If you go to places like Singapore and South Korea, you're going to see really rapid growth in the number and proportion of older people over 20, 30, 40 years, whereas in the UK, of course, we've seen it over a much longer period. So in those countries as well, you might see governments moving quicker, and I suspect we'll be wanting to look to parts of Asia as to how they respond to ageing over the next decade or so.
Well, off the back of Professor Andrew Scott's book, The 100-Year Life, and of course his co-author Linda Grattan, Japan set up a commission to investigate how to restructure society for the 100-year life. And I mean, shouldn't more countries be following that lead?
Yeah. And Japan's a really good example, because Japan's way ahead of everyone else in terms of population aging. I wouldn't say they'd necessarily done everything right. They have introduced a mechanism to pay for funding of social care, and that has created a market for social care. But actually, the Japanese economy has really struggled over 20 or 30 years, and there is strong economic arguments that part of that is because Japanese policymakers and industry have failed to really understand that older consumers want different things and have not delivered the sort of thing that products that older consumers want.
But do older consumers really want different things? I mean, the big middle, the audience that I've defined as the big middle, 45 through 75, I'm not talking about the last 5 years of life, where you're elderly and you obviously have physical comorbidities that you're grappling with. But 45 through 75 right now, isn't it just people and your passions dictate what you want to buy?
Actually, I think you're absolutely right. The challenge I think industry has had across the world has been that it has always sought out the younger, the 18 to 30 consumer. The perception has always been these are the people who've got the money. Therefore, marketing has been focused at those groups. Products have not always been well designed in terms of ensuring they're accessible for all ages. I think we're starting to see big changes in that space. I also agree that actually age itself is not necessarily a good way of, our age doesn't necessarily determine what we want to do.
No longer. It doesn't define anything.
If we're a football fan and like going to the football in our 30s, we probably do in our 50s and 60s and 70s.
We'll continue to buy the paraphernalia.
Absolutely. But I suspect that there are things that do change as we get older. So what we know is that the amount we spend as we get older does decline, particularly when we leave work. Part of that is driven by the fact we're not in work anymore, so we don't pay as much for travel, and we don't buy as many new clothes. But actually, at the same time, I think where I think businesses haven't understood it is that they haven't understood that actually priorities might be changing. So actually, yes, you still love the football, but perhaps what you'd like is a concierge type service that helps deliver you a business class type service that gets you to the football ground, offers you a nice meal and gives you something a little bit extra. And I think even where businesses have got that, they haven't realised that the market is in older people.
There's a blizzard of numbers swimming around my head right now, but it's multiple trillions decided by 50s, 60s, 70s, before infirmity takes over. So
absolutely.
advertisers and companies, manufacturers are really missing a trick. Society is out of sync with this social reality on a grand scale. What are the most troubling aspects for you of this disconnect?
So a few years ago, Lord Filkin produced a report called Ready for Ageing. And
He's the chairman of the
he's the
UK's Foundation for Aging Better.
Yes, that's right. Where he came to the conclusion that we weren't ready for ageing. He produced a follow-up report with his committee a few years later where he claimed we were still not ready for ageing. I think we're still not now 10 years on any better prepared than we were 10 years ago. I think my big concern is that for policymakers and indeed industry, the ageing of our society is something that they've just kept putting off. They've kept putting off making the difficult decisions, challenging decisions, whether they be about public spending, whether they be about how we redesign pensions for a new generation of the population, redesign new financial service products that help people live independently and better for longer. And I think it's just been too easy for politicians to say, well, that can wait for next year when you've got an election in the following year. So I think the big frustration is that demographic change is slow, and as a result there's been no pressure on policymakers to change.
But now with I hate to use these generational tags, but with the boomers coming to the fore and the Gen Xers hot on their heels, we have the aging population. We're now getting the differentials happening. So society needs to catch up because the three-stage life model, it needs to be redesigned. It needs to be overhauled massively to deal with what we're seeing now and in the coming years.
It's absolutely the case that the way we live our lives now and in the future is going to be different, completely different to the way that my grandfather did. The problem is that it's really difficult for most people to live the sort of lives they want to live. The ambition of spending a few years studying and then perhaps a few years in work and then perhaps a few years doing some caring and then restudying. The reality is that we need to save to buy the house, and you can only have children typically up to a certain age, and then you want to save for a pension.
And you're working for the kids, and you want to get them to the best schools, and
absolutely.
They need the proper nutrition.
Yeah, but it's not impossible to foresee a world in the future where actually we do find ways of allowing people to contribute throughout their life, participate in society in whatever they want, the way they want, but actually do it in a different sort of way, and actually, making sure that. And that might mean us working longer, it might mean us working significantly longer, but actually it might mean we don't work between 40 and 45 or 40 and 50. But to do that, what we're going to have to do is ensure that there is no ageism and that people aren't forced out of the workforce at, in their mid-50s. And
how do we change that structurally? Because nobody's grasping the policy nettle in any sort of coherent way right now. There's a lot of talk around it. I've been doing, I think this is number 15 of my podcast, and much of it has been about ageism, and there doesn't seem to be, we're just sort of rolling along, a little bit of talk around here, rhetoric, but nothing seems to be done in a coherent fashion. We've got older people being negatively portrayed as on their way to uselessness. And 55 is when most people think, okay, I'm going to get the call from the HR people, I'm going to be marched out of the office, my life plan is going to be completely blown to smithereens because I'm not going to have any income. So then you get from 60 to 75 people scrabbling around who want to contribute, and they're just being sidelined into doing endless volunteering or low-paid work.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in the UK, the government has been doing some interesting work around older workers and particularly trying to engage businesses in this space. And I think there's likely to be an economic imperative for businesses in that the reality is they're not going to be able to find any workers anymore. So they're going to have to quickly find ways of keeping older workers.
So it's not just declining birth rate, it's Brexit.
Absolutely. If you can't have migration, the care sector is heavily reliant on migrant workers. Our hospitality industry is very reliant on migrant workers. Interestingly, we had a futurologist at one of our events a few years ago who talked about the fact that one of the things you can't really automate is empathy, and that older people tend to have empathy. So actually, how do you create, whether it be hospitality or care industry, that older people actually want to work in? And I think that you've got to accept that the sort of jobs that fast food chains or care homes might be providing in some sectors at the moment may not be designed in the way that is going to be attractive to older people. Now, that doesn't mean to say they can't always be. Actually, you can make those jobs fulfilling, exciting, but at the moment we're targeting young people and we're targeting cheap labour. But coming back to your point, beyond the work the government's doing on older workers and the work government is trying to do focused on preventative health, I think very important. Actually, there is almost nothing going on in government in this space, and it is partly a Brexit thing. Brexit is dominating an agenda.
It's devoured all government activity and attention.
But what determines quality of life in old age? It's things like good quality transport. It's things like not being in pain. It's things like having good quality social relationships.
But we're talking about old age. We're talking about 80s, 90s.
But
the bulk of people now are living in good health. Health spans are longer.
Absolutely.
And so we need to take advantage of the opportunity that this new stage of life presents to us, where we can be working but we're barred from access to the jobs, where we can be contributing in so many ways.
I think that there is a complacency amongst whether it be government or service providers or the voluntary sector about the contribution older people are already making. I remember I did the London Marathon a couple of years and I was involved in the Olympics. A huge number of volunteers were older volunteers because basically they were the only people who could spend 3-4 weeks sitting on a desk, a completely thankless job, but actually one where they got to chat to people and engage. We need that sort of contribution, both in terms of volunteering, but also in terms of work. And
people who are still vital, who've been shut out of the job market, need to be enticed back.
Absolutely.
And there are a lot of other countries, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, they manage their aging population really well. But in the UK, not at all.
No.
I mean, every podcast I've done, people have said we're really on the back foot on this.
And it's still the case in the UK that whilst we've seen growth in the proportion of people working longer, it's still only 12 or 13% of people 65 working. 100 years ago, 7 in 10 men worked at 65. Now it's 12 in 100.
Are we seeing the last bounce of final salary pensions?
So I think what we've seen is, after the Second World War, government was actually really keen to keep older workers in the workplace. There was Pathé News clips of don't retire, stay in work. There was a sense that we needed a workforce to continue to work, to rebuild. Absolutely. Then I think what happened was it got to the 1970s and 80s, and government just had this really slightly irrational panic, and it happened across the whole of Europe, where they thought, oh my goodness, we've got all of these older people, and where are these younger people's jobs going to come from? So what happened was government and the private sector put in financial incentives to encourage people to leave work ridiculously early. Some cases late 40s, very generous pension schemes. Made no sense at all. And it happened across the whole of Europe. So you went from relatively high employment rates of older people, declined, continued to decline, got to the 70s and 80s and fell significantly. And then since the sort of 1990s, governments, really led by places like the Netherlands, have thought this was a mistake. We haven't got enough workers there. There was this old theory of, a lump of labour fallacy, which is that older people are stealing jobs for younger people, which has been completely discredited by most economists. And that led governments and industry to basically kick people out of the workforce too early. And we're now facing a challenge of realising that was a mistake and trying to work out how we turn that around. And it's hard because, people in their 50s are starting to look at their parents who might have retired in their 50s and thinking, well, why can't I?
And the resentment builds. If you were in control of all government policy here in the UK, David, social and economic, what changes would you make tomorrow to reap the benefits of longer, healthy lives and to fight ageism?
I think the first thing I'd say is that there is not an easy solution to the problems that we're facing. So it's not an easy question to answer. And I think one of the things mistakes that politicians have made is actually looked for easy solutions to complex problems. They've said, things like, for example, where they said, right, older people aren't doing enough physical activity, let's give them free swimming, without really any evidence that made any difference at all. And actually it turned out all that happened was people went swimming for free.
Yes.
No one else participated.
I tell you, at my pool, everyone's over 50 and loving it.
Yeah, and absolutely right. But I think politicians just look for those easy solutions like free TV license, and actually we're talking about trying to deliver significant societal change. Now, I think there are. My sense is that the one thing that we really need to do in the UK is actually have a degree of leadership in this space. We actually don't have politicians, or very many politicians, who are really interested and engaged with the ageing of our society and what it means.
But we need people to be redesigning the life course, the institutions, all sectors of it. It's a no-brainer to me.
And one of the challenges you've got is that ageing isn't about health. It's not about social care. It's not really about pensions. It's not about isolation and loneliness. It's about everything. And one of the problems that policymakers have is that they throw things into a box, which is this department or that department or the other department.
All disjointed.
And it means that you have no sense of strategy or coordination about what you're going to do. And that isn't necessarily, we don't want to just put the blame on government here. It's the same with industry. It's the same with us as individuals. We sort of compartmentalise our lives when actually our lives are very difficult. If we want to, go to the shops to buy something, we've got to be able to get there. We've got to ensure that we can move around the town when we get there. We've got to ensure we're in a place where the high street is selling us the sort of things that we want to be doing. We see them as separate activities sometimes.
Right, and it's the lifeblood of everyone to be in a community where
absolutely.
you can get the things you need. But the thing is, surely there needs to be more of a response from civil society as well, because post-war we had the labour movement, decide that kids shouldn't be in factories, and they crafted a society that worked for everyone and didn't exploit, well, not immediately, but with an eye towards the exploitation of everyone. Right now, there's no response from civil society. All of the onus of crafting a life to cover your longer life seems to fall on the individual.
Yeah, and one of the things that's striking in this space is that a significant number, if not the majority, of politicians are aged between 50 and 70. There is a public policy perception that older people are heavily influential and that younger people, and they're already playing a huge part in society. I think what you find actually is politicians of that sort of generation actually spend a lot of time worrying about younger people. So what we end up is really a big advocacy gap where there actually isn't anyone out there coming and saying, actually, we've got to have this campaign. We've got to find a way of delivering the sort of society that we're going to need to have with a completely different demography. And I think we just really struggle with some of those, what some of the changes are we may need to make. And that's everything from what our houses might need to look like through to, say, how we get around a town centre.
As I was saying earlier, a lot of studies have been generated around these issues by the Foundation for Aging Better, a lot of other groups, and if we look globally, there's a lot of activity in this space, yet there's no sort of macro view of it all, where people can say, we need to redesign these structures, we need to be able to access lifelong learning, keep older workers who are still healthy in work so they can contribute to the tax base, so they aren't being seen as a burden by everyone and marginalized and left out of living.
Yeah.
All of the joyful aspects of living.
Yeah. And I think one of the real sort of frustrating things in this space is that we've been talking about those things for 20, 30, 40 years. And there are academics, there are policymakers, there are some people who have been making these points for a very long time now. Why is it it's not hitting the mainstream, and that actually when you hear ageing in the media, it's often an assumption that older people are either living in care homes or they're on a cruise? The reality is that neither is true, and I don't know why we've decided to sort of pigeonhole.
What can we do to actually get the reality of what it means to be over 50, let's say in good health until you're 70, 75, even 80, who knows? How can we get that message to come across and get through mainstream media more loudly, more clearly, in order to elicit some action?
So let me do the glass half full thing for a moment. I suspect that that we are starting to see some change. I remember watching the London Marathon 10 years ago, and there would be huge features of the 80-year-old runner. Now it's not a surprise. I think that we are slowly seeing the sort of change we want in society. The reality is it is very, very slow, and that where we need leadership, and where that comes to things like house building, actually politicians are just too slow at responding to that trend that we've
seen. Do you
seen.
talk to one particular minister within the UK government and find a receptive audience?
So the reality is there isn't really within the UK a single minister responsible. In places like Wales, they're quite interesting. They have got a commissioner for older people. In places like Scandinavia, they've got a minister for the future, which is a really interesting idea. In the UK, we've got ministers for care, for transport, for health, and it seems that government really struggles to pull these together to deliver a sort of the public policy environment that we need.
The Centre was in the headlines recently when your chair, Professor Martin Green, described the UK as completely and institutionally ageist. He called it a national scandal. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, ILC legacy is that we came from an individual who coined the phrase ageism, Robert Butler. It is depressingly still true, despite legislation, that we have a significant problem with ageism in society, whether that be in terms of access to goods and services, continuous access to social care, but also in terms of employment and the workplace, and indeed, I think more significantly, ageism in terms of general attitudes towards older people. It's still, it is still completely acceptable in society to send those birthday cards, which, if it was any other protected group, race, gender, you would find yourself in front of legal court cases. Yet age, it seems perfectly acceptable to still ridicule and be, that goes way beyond legislation to society actually accepting that we're aging, and accepting the
sensitizing
change.
people to the language around it and how ageist their thinking is and their behaviour is.
Absolutely.
We just have to get the big middle in more ears.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right.
Now, the International Longevity Centre held its 4th annual Future of Aging conference a couple of months back. You brought together hundreds of experts in aging and health, housing, finance, business and leisure. What were the biggest takeaways for you from the conference?
Well, it was a big day. It was a big day. So we've been doing the Future of Aging conference for 4 years now, and we started off because we do want to see ourselves as being an organisation focused on the future, focused on the way the world is changing. At the conference, I suppose there were a couple of things that really came across for me. One was that we had a few presenters who came from across the world. Norwegian Health Minister, for example, who talked about exactly your agenda, exactly the fact we need to reinvent and consider the way in which we're looking at ageing. I think one of the most interesting things that came out of it for me is one of the speakers we had is a director of a company called Europa Park, Europe's biggest theme park. So a theme park, you would imagine aimed at teenagers and people in their 20s and 30s. What Europa Park have realised is that, I think they said something like off-season, 40% of their visitors are over 40. Actually, at the same time, grandparents often take grandchildren to the theme park. Now, what Europa Park have done is they've realised that older people want exactly the same as other people, and they've done it well. clean toilets, a Michelin-starred restaurant, nice hotels,
So even
places
if they
to
don't
sit.
have kids in tow, they can visit and enjoy.
Absolutely. So what you do is you tend the kid to the fast food, and you go with your partner to the nice Michelin-starred restaurant while they're on the rides or something like that. But they've realised that actually,
Well, the
whether it be
discerning older person with money to splash.
but also wants to have fun, actually wants to go with the grandchildren to the park, wants to go and see some of these places. So one of the other sessions we did was on the future of play and the fact that there is this sort of, we're allowed to play in childhood, but then sort of it's seen as being something wrong when you get into old age. But
Act your age.
Absolutely. Whereas, why not? Well, and I think one of the, how do we help people have fun and have meaning in across the, in old age? And I think it can't just be about reading books about pensions. It's got to be about, if you want to go to Europa Park, go there. If you want to go to the, Glastonbury Music Festival, go there. If you want to
dance your
actually,
pants off,
absolutely,
have a good time.
And equally, you don't have to go to nightclubs to do this. It might just be about making sure that theatres are, understand that people might want something, a slightly different offer as they age, and might want slightly different things and be willing to pay for it.
And they've got the money. That's the thing.
Absolutely, and we know that.
Most do.
We know on average that older people spend significantly less than they have in. So the average saving per year by older people is about 40 billion a year. So older people are not spending the money they've got. So actually you've got a captive consumer base there if you can offer interesting goods and services for them.
But how are you defining older people along the old life model? If we're talking about older people, 80,
Sure.
85,
Yeah.
90, and maybe they are, sadly, in a care home, or maybe they're living with family, they're not spending that much, everything's taken care of. But now we're looking 45 to 75, the big middle, as I like to call it. I'm spending as much as I ever was.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that does happen, though, is when we leave work, we don't need to spend on certain things. And I think that one of the challenges for industry is how you can work out how to get people to spend their money on different sorts of things as they get older. So I suppose what I'm saying is that it's not cash that is the barrier. People have got money, and that there is potential market there.
We have to make experiences more accessible and more interesting for people of all ages, I'd say. But across, when you're discerning, when you're older, when you've seen that, you've been there, you've done that. Well, like the Europa.
I think my view is that actually, so you have a lot of people arguing different things as to why we start spending less as we get older. Some people will say, well, the marketing industry doesn't target us. Some people will say, well, the products and services aren't well designed according to our needs. Some people will say, we don't know when we're going to die, so actually we might want to save money for 20, 30 years, especially if we haven't got an annuity. My take is that exactly your point about experiences is that one of the big reasons, as well as health, health is a big factor, is that we've got enough stuff. So actually, you get to a point you think, I don't need another garage door, I don't need a new fridge, I don't need a new television. What I actually want is the experience, is the company, is someone to help me do the sort of things that I want to do in a slightly easy way. In your 20s, you might be willing to go and sit at the back of the plane to go to Australia for 24 hours and then change, in fact, do over 40 hours and change 4 times for a cheap flight. You get to your 50s and you might think, actually, I don't want to do that. So actually, how do you offer different sorts of services that are attractive to consumers who might have only been experienced to that 40-hour hell journey, but perhaps there are easier and better ways and
things
clearly
can be
there are.
packaged differently, more attractively.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's a heaviness around aging. Whenever we talk about midlife, over 50s, there's no lightness in it, lightness of being. I really like what you were saying about the importance of play.
Yeah, and I think, whether it be play, whether it be, we did some interesting work in the dementia scale, dementia and music, but one of the things that came out of that is there are a huge number of people in the music world, in the arts world, in the theatre world, who really want to engage older people in a different sort of way. And I think, so I'm chair of a charity that supports older people to live independently. So again, at the, typically people in their 70s and 80s, supports older people to live actively and healthily. They had fairly conventional, you'd think, knitting group. They have the company, they chat. The knitting group went and decided to sit around Damien Hirst's sheep and knit for the day, and became sort of part of the exhibit for the day.
That's brilliant.
And
so taking them out of what's expected,
absolutely.
Bunch of grannies knitting in a circle.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to start doing is, like, with whether it be with play, is start just giving people permission to do stuff and to try out different things. Why shouldn't you? If you want to go to Glastonbury in your 70s for the first time, go. If you want to start following a football team or start engaging with music, find ways of going. And I think that's where industry and the government has not helped. We've perceived certain things of younger people, and therefore there hasn't been any sense of, well, let's try and work out how we ensure that people in their 40s, 50s and 60s are accepted in those. I was with a friend who was talking at a most simple level about an all-you-can-eat buffet in central London, and he said, look around, there's no older people. And, actually part of it is because we've designed these services in a way that if you haven't used them before, you may not understand and engage. And I'm not
but
even necessarily
internal.
just...
The drumbeat of ageism is between our ears.
We
grow up thinking, these are the appropriate activities for this age, and then when I'm 50, I'm not going to be doing that. And what we have to do is just banish all that thinking.
Definitely. And I, definitely say that I am that myself. The university I went to in the summer, a bit of a cycle route, and we happened to get there on a Saturday night, and it was the Saturday night of the student disco, but actually it was one of these weird alternative ones. It wasn't just students, and you know what? There was a bit of me thought, I genuinely said, I'm too old for that now, and actually I didn't do it, and I slightly regret it. But I do also think, part of it is was the fear of being the two weird old men in the corner, but actually there was also a sense of why.
Let's make it a mission to entice everyone to go to
do
the
what
discos,
they used to do, or what you want to
do whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we have to be age agnostic.
Yeah, absolutely.
We really have to just reclaim our birthdays, reclaim all the activities that we liked as kids. If you want to jump on a trampoline in the middle of your backyard, who cares what the neighbours think if you're 68?
Absolutely. Again, let me say the glass half full. You look at the artists performing at Glastonbury, the vast majority of them are now older, actually, particularly headliners. If you go to concerts at the O2, the reality is 20-year-olds can't afford £100 tickets to go. And actually audiences tend to be people in their 40s, 50s, 60s for these sorts of events. So on the one hand, people are doing that. On the other hand, I don't think there has been any sense of intentional planning or real sort of understanding about how we need to adapt to those services better and those products.
Well, there are more of us around now who are older, so ergo, there are going to be more of us attending concerts and splashing out on the tickets.
Absolutely.
We've covered pretty exhaustively the challenges around living healthy longer and the general negativity surrounding aging. What's giving you hope? Public or private initiatives, grassroots campaigns that are changing the status quo for the better across the world, not just in the UK?
So I think one of the really exciting things is that there are lots of people around in startups, in new technology, who for the first time are beginning to engage with aging. I was involved in some competitions 5 or 6 years ago with a big mobile phone operator who was trying to identify ideas to help people live well in old age, and we ended up with 60 applications, of which 50 were emergency alarm systems. We've just done a similar initiative here in the UK, and we've had really interesting ideas. We've had different sorts of companies. I think for the first time what you're starting to do is get new, both young and old entrepreneurs who are coming and saying there is a market here, and actually what people don't want is another emergency alarm. What they might want is a concierge service or virtual reality aeroplane trip or something that is completely different that helps fulfill wishes and build relationships.
Yeah, we have to start thinking across the age spectrum. It's those experiences again. No matter what our age, we are all looking for things that excite us, that we want to do. We're living our lives.
So, and my sense is that companies are ahead of government now in this space. So I know I've been very critical of companies so far, but the reality is that there are companies out there, they're not shouting about it, but they are working to make life a little bit easier for all of us. The reality is, as we get older, and that this is not into our 80s and 90s, our eyesight does go a little bit, our hearing does go a bit. There are certain things where we might just need things to be a tiny bit easier to ensure that we can live our lives well. Companies like Amazon have spent millions of pounds on redesigning packaging to make it easy to open. Now that makes it easy for a 18-year-old or a 10-year-old kid, but it makes it easier for a 50-year-old and a 60-year-old. Companies like Google realise that actually not everyone has an eyesight that allows you to read an 8-point font, so they increased the size of the box that you type in.
Well, it's
and
like
that's
BMW did on its assembly lines as well, because Germany's huge in the area of managing its aging workforce.
Absolutely. So you are seeing companies who are beginning to make, I'm not talking about producing health products or disability products, but just realising that good quality accessible design works for younger people and older people alike, and I think that's where the change is. Companies like in the UK like Lakeland, who produce good quality, accessible, nicely designed kitchenware, works for fans of Great British Bake Off, works for people who want a tin opener that actually works, which is everyone. You'll notice that where they're based is often in areas where there's a high proportion of people in their 50s, 60s and 70s, because actually people enjoy the hobby, they like doing it, they want good quality stuff.
Well, are they working at the company as well, helping manufacture these
I don't
things?
know, but it'd be interesting to see. But I think there are some companies out there who are starting to realise that you don't need to start producing disability products to engage with an older consumer. You need to just make sure that your current products and services don't turn people off. And at the most basic level, that includes things like, when you're advertising, don't always just have photos of younger people.
And don't have the stock photos of the grey hairs either, taking
terrible
the cruise,
photos, terrible stock photos
looking at the
of
retirement
older
book with
people.
glee.
Absolutely. One of my pet hates the stock photos. But, there are others who are getting into this. And there was a really interesting poster campaign from Heathrow Airport this year where they had, in effect, story of 3 or 4 generations. But it started off people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and they had the photos and a story which said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, And actually, historically, those sorts of ad campaigns would have been people in their 20s. When
who had more road ahead of them
absolutely.
than behind them.
And yet, actually, if you go in business class lounges in airports, it's not 20-year-olds in there, it's people in their 40s, 50s and 60s
the people
in
who
there.
are still working or can afford to travel.
Absolutely. I think they're starting to... So that's where I think companies are starting to realise that they...
But who was behind those posters at Heathrow?
I don't know. It would have been the Heathrow ad agency, but it's interesting to see that
Well, if we
starting
can get
to
some
change.
of those messages out in the mainstream, that will start to change the narrative and turn it more toward the positive. Because we don't ever see a 60-year-old enthusing about what their expectations are for the next 10 years.
No, absolutely. And we do need to, I think people need to... we do need to give people, individuals, a bit more support to realise, but as I said earlier, to give people permission to do things, but also be a bit more aware of the opportunities out there, whether it be, taking out, whether it be in terms of new products and services, whether it be in terms of new experiences. The organisations like Voluntary Service Overseas, I don't think has an upper age limit. You can go and volunteer to work in Africa or Asia in your 60s, 70s and beyond.
But then why don't you at the International Longevity Centre partner up with some companies and do a fair, do an exhibition, get all of these interesting threads and pull them together in an event where people can go over 45, 60, people in midlife transition where they're raring to go and they still... I count myself among them. There's so much I would like to do, but I've often complained in previous episodes of the podcast, the access points are difficult to find.
It's really hard. And it's probably I suppose one of the challenges is that how do you actually how do you market that sort of thing? Because actually, as we've talked about, age itself is not an easy
You mean the
thing.
event I'm
Yeah.
proposing? Well, we get all the life insurance people
Yeah,
involved. We can get a lot of corporates to sponsor it.
Absolutely. But I meant in terms more of how do you actually brand it? Because actually, if we all deny, something, one of the things that's interesting is that companies that 10, 15 years ago used to say we sell products for people in their 50s, or they don't use age anymore. One of the problems is that the minute we start saying, but I don't think it's necessarily just that. I think it's that the minute you start saying this is for someone of that age, people think, well, that's not for me. And I think a better solution is finding a way of creating aspirational opportunities for people of all ages within travel shows that already exist and within those sorts of places. And I think at the moment that's where the failing is. I had a colleague who did some work on kitchens and kitchen design, and she decided to go to one of these big kitchen shows where they have all these companies out there telling you what the best sort of new kitchens are, and she went around and asked all of them about accessible kitchens. And again, when I mean accessible kitchens, I mean doors that open easily, nice attractive kitchens, but something you might want to buy in your 40s and 50s, because actually it's quite hard to reach above a certain shelf, and but for some reason that industry just doesn't get it. She went round and found not a single one who could say, right, actually this product is not just age proofing, but is actually something that is an aspirational product for you.
I guess they don't recognise the cohort of older folks, let's face it.
Absolutely.
They just don't see there's much profit bounce in that.
And I think part of it is this challenge of in that space where, what they might respond and say is, oh, that's not for you, that's for an elderly lady. Or and actually that's not the point. The reality is what we need to be doing is fitting the bath rail before we have the fall, not after we have the fall. We need to be preparing ourselves for old age, but also ensuring that and recognising that ageing is happening, almost as a way of making sure we prevent some of the ill effects of old age. It's a fascinating area, but I don't think there are easy solutions in the short run. But as I say, industry has started to realise the business potential. And one of the things we are going to be doing this year is organising a business summit on ageing, and then following that up with our conference this year. We'll focus on where you started on how we make the most of that longevity dividend.
Well, I look forward to attending both of those events this year. Thank you so much, David.
Great. Thank you very much.
David Sinclair, Director of the International Longevity Centre, the UK's specialist think tank on the impact of longevity on society. Links to the centre, as ever, in the show notes, which you can find at susanflory.com and everywhere you subscribe and listen to The Big Middle. Thanks so much for your company. Until next time, bye-bye.